Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to our symposium today. Um, I'm going to be just talking about the basic medical science and application of cannabis. Um, just to give you a brief overview, I'm just going to talk a little bit about cannabis history, plant biology, active compounds, a little bit of pharmacology, and again, more about the practical application is where I'll focus. Cannabis has been a plant that's been around for many years. There's evidence of it dating back down to 12,000 years ago. This is not a new substance or something new that is unfamiliar to us. Just to give you a brief introduction to the plant itself, if you haven't seen it before, you kind of see the full plant here on the left side, and you can see the leaf that we're usually kind of associated with medical cannabis, but the actual product is within the flower material itself, and that's what we have on the right side. Frames of that are magnified going down. Excuse me. The main thing to note there is that that last frame is what's called the trichome, and that's the component of the cannabis that contains the cannabinoids that we're going to be talking about. We have two distinct strains of cannabis, and this is more from a classification standpoint. One is sativa, and the other one is indica. Those are the two main terms that people kind of throw around in terms of determining which kinds of cannabis it is. They have slightly different effects and characteristics, not only in the plant morphology itself and how it actually grows, but some of the compounds it produces does produce slightly different effects in different situations. Cannabinoids, these are the compounds that we're going to talk about, this is what's actually in those little trichomes that we kind of saw in the first picture. There's many different cannabinoids. The main interesting one for us is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is also known as THC. This is what's responsible for the euphoric effects, as well as many of the medicinal properties as well. And then this is the component that is actually classified as a Schedule 1 drug by the DEA, and we'll get a little bit more into that. The other compounds there are different identified cannabinoids. You'll hear the term CBD quite a bit, and that's usually the term given to these compounds that don't contain THC. So that's really the main difference. There's a lot of different classifications and a lot of different details about it, but for the most part, we're either talking about THC or we're talking about CBD. So that's really the two separate ones. A little bit about how this works. So this is like a nerve terminal. It may not make a whole lot of sense, but what's important to know is that we have these receptors, CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors, and this is part of our own cannabinoid system. And we also produce our own endogenous cannabinoids, which are cannabinoids made by our own body. And those are the 2-AG and anandamide, and there's a few more that they're starting to identify now. And those compounds work in our body on those receptors. But when we consume cannabinoids, the CBD, THC, these are the receptors it's working on, is CB1 and CB2. And the activation of those receptors causes some differences in the way the chemicals between nerve endings are transmitted. And that's really what allows us to figure out what the effects are and how it kind of works. Unlike other medications, we're not really changing a whole lot of what's happening here or the amounts, but it's really more about how long some of those effects last and when those appropriate chemical signals are transmitted. So you have a few different ways that you can use cannabis. There's of course, the smoked version that everybody kind of talks about, smoking it from a joint. There's also vaporizers that can produce products for inhalation without the products of combustion. So the important things to know about inhaled version is that it's pretty rapid onset of action, and you're going to get this mostly effective within the internal circulation. So your internal organs, your brain, your heart, your lungs are going to get majority of the cannabinoids and THC when you inhale it. When you can also eat it, and there's also other pharmaceutical forms of this as well, and the pharmaceutical form is called durabinol. And we kind of have a lot of our studies and information also in terms of the bioavailability and absorption of these things through those medications. But the main thing, again, to take away is that when you ingest it, it's a slower absorption. You're getting a smaller pool of cannabinoids to a larger pool of blood, and you actually get that circulating more towards the periphery with less effect from a euphoric side. And that's all really when it comes down to dosing this, and we'll get into that as well. You have a few other ways too. Rectal, there's rectal suppositories. People use that to improve the cannabinoid uptake without having the THC effect because it's absorbed through the rectum. There's just some differences in how that drug is metabolized, so it has less of effect to the brain, but you can actually increase the amount of cannabinoids you're taking. They have lotions, creams, different topical applications as well, useful in a lot of pain situations, neuropathy, as well as arthritis, psoriasis, eczema, different skin conditions as well. So metabolism occurs mainly in the liver, but you do have some of it happening in the renal system as well. So pain management is probably the number one thing that I deal with in the office, and it has a lot of different benefits from when it comes to pain, and this is kind of a slide to tell more about why it has different effects on pain. It's not like our regular opiate medications that actually deaden pain. So if someone has a broken arm, I can give them enough narcotic, and they won't feel it when I push or touch on that arm. But it's not the same thing with cannabis. There's not an amount of cannabis I can give somebody and then touch their arm without them having pain. And that's the kind of the important thing to know as well. And the real benefit kind of happens from a global standpoint. So it's not just about the actual pain sensation we're decreasing, but we're improving their levels of fatigue. They're actually able to take a lot of their other medications on a regular basis, and that makes them more effective. And then we've also used it in before physical therapy and other types of therapy that people go through that kind of they develop pain in. So it's not what we always kind of think about. I'm in pain and I take a medication, but it really kind of is a way to use the medication and still can continue doing other treatments and therapies. Also, it reduces anxiety, and anxiety is a big problem in terms of things that happen when someone has multiple chronic illnesses. Neurological disorders, that's one of our other areas of interest, especially with multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, different other neurological and muscular disorders. It's had a lot of benefits, especially controlling the symptoms, which usually include similar ones like spasticity, tremor, bladder dysfunction, things like that. And we're really seeing a lot of different more practical applications and uses where this is becoming something where people are able to kind of use this for their symptoms without having to take multiple medications. We can kind of cover a variety of symptoms with one medication. Dosing, so this is probably a more interesting area. There's no real specific dosing guidelines. This isn't like other medications where there's a package insert and there's a lot of information about it. Much of this has been kind of something I've figured out from using it within patients, and a lot of it from the patients and caregivers and different people in the industry kind of sharing information. So, typically we start slow, and we're not talking about, again, smoking this from a standpoint of inhalation. We're typically using capsules that are milligram dose based. So, we can extract cannabis now, we can extract all those cannabinoids, and we can kind of separate a lot of that out, a lot of the other plant material out, and have products that we can really rely on the dosing. So milligram dosage is much more applicable in this situation now, and we have a variety of different dosages that someone can use. So we would start them slow, kind of titrate them up to what they tolerate based on their symptoms, and basically everyone has their own dose, so there's no set dose that I would start on any one person. You just have to figure that out kind of as you try it out. The important thing to know is that there's no toxic limits. So, those CB1 and CB2 receptors that we were talking about where these compounds actually work don't exist in your brainstem where you control your heart rate, your respiratory rate, your blood pressure, and those vital organ vital signs that we use as a metric there. So really it's very safe and for the most part you won't have any kind of major toxic toxic effects. The adverse effects that we do know are mostly short-term memory loss, and that's really limited to the time of use. And the other issue is cyclic vomiting syndrome. Although I haven't seen too many cases of this myself, it has been reported and seems to be there's some association with chronic or excessive cannabis use. There's no reported deaths from any amount of cannabis used. They estimate the lethal dose to be 30 milligrams per kilogram IV, which really isn't a form or usage that is actually used. I just kind of have it up there for completeness. And there's no real known drug interactions. It can increase the sedating effect of certain medications, but for the most part, there's no interaction. So qualifying conditions, some of you may know this, but this is the state of Michigan's two categories that they allow medical cannabis use for. So category A is a list of conditions, and category B is a list of symptoms. Most of them go hand in hand when it comes to the different things that you're dealing with. Things on the left typically cause the things on the right. But there's a lot of other conditions that still cause the symptoms on the right. And a lot of times they're conditions that cause multiple symptoms. And so these are the different things that we can actually use cannabis for. So as you can see, it covers quite a bit of different medical problems or conditions when you use category B. Legal issues and risk from a physician standpoint. There isn't much risk. The state law protects the physicians very well. Patients are obviously subject to all the laws and rules that the state of Michigan has placed, and for the most part, they're not difficult to follow. They're not stringent, and still allow for pretty practical use of the cannabis. It's considered a recommendation only from a physician because we're not legally able to prescribe. Prescribing DEA Schedule I drugs is actually illegal, so this is the way the state law kind of worded this to make sure that we weren't causing other legal infractions. The process, we evaluate the patient, which is review of the conditions, their medical records, and then we'll kind of do our own evaluation otherwise. We make a recommendation based on that situation and basically go on to educate the patient. This is probably the most important part of what I do is educating patients on the basic effects, the rules, and how to use it. Not everybody who comes in, as a lot of people think, are people who use this all the time. Many of these people are patients who have never used cannabis before and don't really otherwise have any particular method or way of acclimating themselves to it. We'll give referrals to qualified cannabis professionals, as I like to call them. And that's really people who are somewhat trained to deal with patients and medical conditions itself and kind of the situations that arise when patients are trying medications and dealing with other things. And then we'll follow up with the patient, so basically evaluate and maintain effective treatment just if they're having any other issues from that standpoint. Most of the statistics and everything are reportable, so there's a lot of information that the state actually goes through and keeps track of in terms of how many prescriptions or recommendations are given and the types of qualifying conditions that are actually submitted. These are my sources, just for you to look at. I can always share that with you as well. But there is a lot of good research and good information that's out there. It's just sifting through that and applying it practically that's kind of important.
Good evening, all of you. I appreciate you being here. And for any of you here who were here before, you've probably you've already pretty well absorbed this topic, um, and probably are an advocate of this as well. I think that this is a really important area, largely because it's providing a medication that, if you think of it as a medication, not as a recreational drug, it's providing a medication that actually has a therapeutic effect with virtually no side effects. And it's hard to find that sort of thing out there. And what you do find out there is drugs that are alternatives to cannabis that are quite powerful and have many side effects. So it's pretty logical that we move forward on this thing, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to give you a little, where's forward? There we go. Medical cannabis is just one of many agents that are used that are derived from plants. And I just have a little list here of some of them. Many or all of you have used aspirin, I'm guessing, unless it doesn't work for you. And many other drugs on that list are, all of those things are derived from plants. We get a lot of good stuff from plants. So the first question is, where does the current use of medical cannabis come from? And Dr. Nakadar gave a really nice background on this. But there's evidence is known for something like 60,000 years. The oldest written evidence on botanical medications in general, and you don't find writings that are terribly old, so just to have one is pretty amazing. It was on a 5,000-year-old slab from Sumeria that included 12 recipes for a variety of alkaloids. It doesn't mention cannabis, but it's within the same ballpark. The earliest reference that I've seen to cannabis was from a Chinese emperor, 2900 before the Common Era, which would be almost 5,000 years ago. And he noted it possessed both yin and yang principles. So you might want to take note of that, just in case those are important to you. In terms of the specific pharmacologic use, the earliest record I found was in a Chinese pharmacopoeia from 1500 BCE. And moving closer to the present, we have writings from Zoroaster in the Middle East, about 700 before the Common Era. And moving to the birth of our own nation, we have three very famous people, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, who all grew what they were probably thinking of as hemp, because they were probably using it as rope, because it's a very tough fiber and you can use it to put around your animal and put around your wagon and allow the animal to drag the wagon. They probably were not talking about it in terms of its pharmacologic effect, but there's no record of that I know, so it is possible. Let's see. So moving into the effectiveness of this drug, I found a note in prevention.com, which is sort of a populist magazine that refers to medical treatments, giving scores of the current use of cannabis for a number of indications. And these, of course, are due to change as people's use of the drug changes. But as you can see here, it's extremely effective for nausea relief for cancer and for epilepsy. It's very effective for multiple sclerosis and for what's called burning pain. Less so for some other things, Alzheimer's and PTSD. So there are a suite of positive effects from this thing. There are a number of gaps in current research, however, and as you can imagine, it's a little difficult to do research, given that the federal government is basically prohibited doing research on a federal level. So getting research funds is something that people have to scramble to do. One of which would be the notion of what is the herbal synergy of the different active components of cannabis. Everybody's heard of THC. A lot of people have heard of cannabidiols as Dr. Nakadar pointed out, there are a lot of other chemicals in there that can be presented in different concentrations to one another in different parts of the plant or in different cultivars of the plant. So you have that kind of thing. You have things like the pharmacokinetics, which is what's the rate at which the drug takes an effect, cannabis and other drug interactions, and a variety of other things. So there are a number of research gaps that really need to be addressed. Some of the things related to safety have more to do with the production of the plant. For example, heavy metals will appear in certain soils. So that's a concern. But those things are expected to be tested for in any product that's used commercially. So what should be considered in doing clinical research studies on cannabis? Dosing it may be hard to quantify unless you have a highly reproducible batch of it. I'm not sure how that works, but I presume that it can be done. The notion of herbal synergy has not been widely tested in clinical trials. But most of these issues can be tested if there's a resolution to do that. What do the clinical findings and the experience of practitioners say? Obviously, we know that there is significant pain control. We know that it may become a non-addicting substitute for opioid drugs. And there are a variety of other conditions that can be optimized with the use of cannabis. A number of gaps that exist in this based on simply quality control. That may be more likely to be true of the recreational product. So, I don't think regulators are going to be too concerned about recreational uses. But the standardization of all of this is certainly possible, and if at some point this becomes regulated in the way that alcohol is regulated, then all of these sources of adverse effects themselves would be regulated, and you would know just how much heavy metals and other things you'd be taking along with your cannabis. I've found few reliable medical studies. I think probably the main reason for that is people can't get grants to do it. Grants come from the federal government, and the federal government is not in favor. So it pretty much closes that door. The variance on available active components is not something that's terribly well controlled. For example, the VA in that statement in the middle will not conduct research into whether medical marijuana would help veterans suffering from PTSD. That seems a little closed-minded to me, but that's what they have to say. And there are a variety of other examples of societal rejection of cannabis, and obviously there are what I would call most sentient people seem to think it's not such a bad thing for us to at least understand the potential good things and the harms. And one of the most important good things is reduction of opioid use. I talked about this a little bit the last time we had this meeting. There was a study of 185 patients at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, and they all were using cannabis, and 64% of them experienced a reduction in their need for opioid drugs. They also had fewer side effects, and if you've ever taken, if you have a horrible accident of some kind and you're put on opioid drugs, you're probably not going to remember much. You'll wake up with a headache and a lot of other things. So, there are a few studies that are out there. Cannabis has been demonstrated from another University of Michigan study to be more effective for severe centralized chronic pain, and also has been noted to reduce chronic opioid use in the public press. In 2014, over 28,000 fewer reported overdose deaths due to opioids. So one of the problems with opioids, aside from that, is their cost is skyrocketing. It was noted in 2006 that naloxone was $1 a dose. Now it's about $40 a dose. I don't think anybody in this room has seen their salary go up 40-fold in that period. So that is, that's pretty crazy. So an estimate that I found on obviously an advocacy site called cannabis.net, but they estimate that opioid use would be reduced by 11% already by substituting cannabis. So one would expect that further use of cannabis could reduce the use of opioid drugs. Of course, there's a huge industry around opioid drugs that is going to say, wait a second, let's just support what it says in the federal law already. So a lot of it comes down to that. In terms of the overdose frequency in the USA, I just grabbed this. This is off of the CDC, Center for Disease Control website, and it's showing overdose deaths from 2000 to 2016. And as you can see, that blue line for synthetic opioids, that's going to be literally through the roof. It's on its way there already. And that's a bit over 2 years ago. So I don't know what the data are now, but it can't be less. And that's a variety of drugs that are just out there and one can take them. And what I would suggest is a reasonable substitute. Gotta go the right direction. Overdose deaths due to medical cannabis, very close to zero. You may draw your own conclusion from that. I'd also like to remind you that therapeutic cannabis is recognized by FDA for specific medical indications. So it's not completely outside of the system. And an experienced physician, as Dr. Nakadar can offer a lot of assistance in guiding patients through the experience of using an agent that's very different from something they've already taken. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dive into the law here. We're going to address a few things in my short time with you here this evening. We'll look at some federal issues that have arose, look at the current status of medical marijuana in Michigan, and we'll also ask ourselves, what does this look like on a local level? And we'll talk about ordinances, what they look like in certain places, and also talk about the community and public safety. First thing we want to look at here is the Sessions memo. There's been a lot of talk about this memo. There's been a lot of articles written on it. Not a lot of people have seen the memo. So this is it. One single page, 3 paragraphs and footnotes. And what does it really say? I mean, initially I'll say not that much. So the first paragraph talks about, well, generally marijuana is illegal. These activities serve as the basis for prosecution of crimes, and it talks about some ancillary crimes. It doesn't directly say, there's an issue with marijuana itself. It says money laundering, unlicensed money transmitter, Bank Secrecy Act violations. So the memo starts off talking about these more white-collar offenses, saying, well, we may not directly go after these things, but let's put these things on the radar. If you're not paying your taxes, you're laundering money, this needs to go on the radar. Next paragraph is really reiterating that this is a directive to the 55 or so appointed U.S. attorneys throughout the country. So we have 2 here in Michigan. We have the Western District, Eastern District. The recent appointee to the Eastern District is Matthew Schneider, who actually spoke on this and said, this isn't one of my priorities. The reason that he addressed that was because of this paragraph. So this paragraph is really saying, prioritize what you want to prosecute. And we have a representative here from the prosecutor's office, I'm sure, who can speak to that as well. But prosecutors follow well-established principles. They decide what to prosecute based on certain considerations, resources, and priorities set by the Attorney General, seriousness of the crime, deterrent effect of criminal activity, and the cumulative impact particular crimes have on the community. So again, that was the paragraph that the U.S. Attorney to the Eastern District was speaking to. He said, well, I acknowledge this paragraph, I acknowledge what this says, but you know what, at this time, this is not a priority. We're going after gangs, we're going after violent crimes, we're going after those different things. And the last part is really what most of the headlines were about, and it's about this Cole memo, which was a previous memo from 2012, And so this memo states that it's being rescinded. So it says previous nationwide guidance specific to marijuana enforcement is unnecessary and is rescinded effective immediately. And so the idea there is, again, that memo just said, we're not going to go after these marijuana offenders. We're not going to really devote government resources toward the enforcement of marijuana. So this really just returned us to the status quo. But effectively, if somebody's violating the law, they're violating the law. So really this is talking about, again, back to the first paragraph, money laundering, unlicensed money transmitter, Bank Secrecy Act. So those are the things it's trying to put on the radar, and this is really going to be handled on a district-by-district basis across the country. But there hasn't, now about a month and a half in, since this memo, there really hasn't been a real change in policy across the country as far as anyone can tell. Medical marijuana in Michigan, dating back to 2008, we had the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act. We heard a lot about, there was a 5-to-1 patient ratio. There could be a caregiver. You're a licensed caregiver, you can have your 5 patients. The number 72, you may have heard a lot. Each patient can have 12 plants. The caregiver can have 12 plants. You can grow 72 plants. So we worked within that framework for about 8 years. We started seeing dispensaries pop up. Those dispensaries were operating in what's been called the gray area for some time, until in 2016, the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act came into play. That's the new framework which authorizes, it's a 5-tier system. You have your growers, processors, provisioning centers, which are dispensaries. You have safety compliance facilities, which test the marijuana, and you have secure transporters. The idea is you have this 5-tier system that services the industry that passed late 16, and applications for medical marijuana applications to the state began as of December 15th, 2017. Just prior to licensing beginning, the state put in place emergency rules. Those rules have a lot to do with and explain the application process and also how locations and licensees can operate until the final rules are in place. So the license process has 2 parts to the application. There's a pre-qualification, which is for the person itself or the applicant itself. You can apply with that without having a location. It's just really about you and interested parties, and it's really like a initial vetting process. The second part is location-specific facility licensing. That's when you get as deep as a marketing plan, a facility plan, a site plan, and all of that type of stuff. About a month ago, a little over a month ago, there was a cleanup bill that passed, House Bill 5144, which I'm sure Representative Phelps is very familiar with, and that did a few things. One thing it did was a lot of the CPAs were coming out and saying, well, the application requires a CPA to say that this person has the required amount of capitalization and to actually attest that the person has what the act and what the rules require somebody to have in cash, liquid cash, and in assets. For example, for a Class C grower license, they'll say you have to have $500,000 in assets, of which $125,000 of that has to be in liquid cash. And so the CPAs attest. The CPAs said, well, how do we know that we're protected from prosecution? And so this bill gave CPAs protections. It also gave state financial institutions protections if they were accepting proceeds that were from marijuana sales. So one provision of that cleanup bill said that CPAs and bank institutions are protected from state or local administrative, criminal, or civil sanctions if a CPA attests to someone's application or if a bank institution accepts proceeds. The other thing is it addresses vertical integration, which is the idea that you could have a processor, a grower, and a provisioning center in the same facility. So it really clarified that you can have those 3 in a single facility, and further said that is the only arrangement, as long as you're not traversing a public road, it's the only arrangement where you don't have to use a secure transporter to get from a processor or a grow to a provisioning center. And that bill also gave former caregivers a way of getting rid of their final supply, if you will. So until December of 2018, a licensed grower can bring in a caregiver who would relinquish their license, and that caregiver has 30 days from becoming an employee or 30 days from actually being the licensee to take their entire supply as a caregiver under the old act. Under the 2008 Act, they can bring their current supply, bring it in legally, get paid for it, and make it part of the seed to sale tracking system. So that gave us a way to really eliminate what would create somewhat of a black market for people that were trying to that were transitioning from being a caregiver to a state licensed facility. And the most, and then in addition to that, there's the advisory board that Dr. Nakadar is on. There was simply a clarification that said that there'd be a few more appointments, and their first meeting would be March of 2018. Lastly, as of last week, February 15th, the state released a universal symbol. So anything that contains THC must have that exact symbol on the medicine, and that's available through the state. You can download it, you can make stickers out of it, you can do whatever you want with it, and so that's a recent development. That February 15th date's also been, some of you may have heard that date. That was a date under Emergency Rule 19. That a location that was given local approval already, authorized by their municipality, if they have their state application in by February 15th, they can continue operating until they get their state approval. So that was a date that's come and gone, and so a lot of people were trying to get their applications in. The most recent, in terms of applications, the most recent stat I found was from like a January 20th article that said there were 20 complete applications as of January 20th. So there may have been a whole bunch that became complete as of February 15th, but the number still is not as much as I think the state had expected. On a local level, what do these ordinances look like? And let's talk a little bit about ordinances. So the state law says that in order for marijuana to exist anywhere, the local municipality, the city, the township, the village, has to say, yes, we authorize it. That's section 205 of the act. And if the municipality authorizes it, they do it through an opt-in process. They say, yes, we're in. And simultaneously or soon after that, they then put an ordinance in place that has certain things in it that says where they can be in relation to other types of buildings and where they can't be. And there's certain things that are considered practical considerations, constituent considerations, and some examples of what, and really the differences between municipalities is usually the buffer distances, the distances that the facilities can be from, against certain things. So if you look at, these are just 4 examples. If you take a look at Ann Arbor has one location restriction, and it's 1,000 feet from a school, K through 12 school, and that's it. So Ann Arbor is a municipality that said, well, we're not that concerned about where this is from a house or a church or any other religious institution or a park or a child care facility. They said, well, they look at the medicinal benefits of it, and if you look at some of their planning minutes and their council minutes, there's a real understanding of a lot of the things that Dr. Nakadar, Dr. Smith have mentioned, and so they say, well, we look at this as a medicine. We don't prevent CVSs from being a certain distance from these other facilities. Why are we preventing marijuana facilities from being a large distance away? We also have Centerline, which is at 400 feet from childcare, 200 feet from parks, 400 feet from religious, 400 feet from schools. Lansing, 500 feet childcare, 500 feet from parks, 500 feet from religious, and 1,000 feet from schools. And then Ypsilanti followed Ann Arbor. What's significant about Lansing is they even, and somebody asked this question last time about how the measurement happens. The measurement is typically from lot line to lot line. Lansing took a very practical consideration and said, well, we think it should be from playground equipment because some parks don't have a presence or they're old parks or dilapidated parks. So they said wherever there's playground equipment, we're going to measure from the distance from playground equipment to the facility itself. So that was an interesting provision. Economic benefits at a local level, you have jobs, you have tax revenue, there's an annual filing fee for each facility, and then each local unit of government gets a pro rata share of the state excise fund. There's a 3% tax and a 6% sales tax, and the municipality is getting its 3%, a portion of that 3% based on its facilities. And then you have a couple of real-world examples in Colorado where the $475,000 the municipality received went toward college scholarships, and the city of Denver used marijuana revenue to build a concert hall. And then there's also benefits use of local contractors in addition to the jobs. Public safety, 2014 article out of the University of Texas published on the National Institute of Health website actually found, contrary to what conventional wisdom is, and in fact, any research in this area, peer-reviewed articles, supports the premise in this article, which is that state medical marijuana licensing may be correlated with a reduction of homicide and assault rates and overall crime. And a lot of that has to do with the standard by deterrent effect. I mean, you have some buildings that may be old and unoccupied and dilapidated. If you put a business there and there are people that occupy it, occupants tend to reduce crime in areas where there would otherwise be not a lot of activity around, and lighting goes in and different things go in, and you have an infrastructure that supports businesses. Harvard Business Review, more recent article, 2017 article, quote, dispensaries were not the crime magnets that they were often described as, but instead reduced crime in their immediate vicinity. And that article actually does a good job of explaining that standard by effect, really strong research, and could almost couldn't really find anything to the contrary compared to these two articles here. And then thanks to the legislator and representatives like Representative Phelps, the state did a good job of putting certain protections in place across the state that really make it so that the local municipalities don't have to do as much. So, for example, on the marketing side of things, there cannot be an advertisement that's visible from a street, sidewalk, park, or public place that advertises a marijuana product. And any products must be marketed as or advertised as medical marijuana for use by a qualified patient or caregiver. And then they must not be marketed to anyone under 17 years of age. Employees, there's a requirement that there's a criminal background check. If there's any charges within the past 10 years, a controlled substance related one, they shall not be hired. And then there's extensive training requirements as well for every employee. Standard operating procedures need to be in place. It's all part of the licensing process. And so to sum it up, I think municipalities should look to their specific interests of their constituents, their specific interests of the medicinal benefit behind marijuana, and come up with policies that are practical and that are supportive of the overall community, and also consider these safety considerations as well. Thank you for your time, and great to be here today.